Welcome to the Court of History. I'm Sidney Blumenthal. I'm here with my colleague, Sean Wilentz, historian at Princeton University. And we are discussing the whole atmosphere and background of crime and punishment. It's one incident after another. Steve Bannon said that they were going to flood the zone with shit, he said. But the sewage, a lot of it seems semi-criminal to me. They are running around arresting a mayor, a judge. They're throwing a U.S. senator on the ground in handcuffs. They're creating a kind of police state where people are arrested without warrants and not brought before courts of any kind. Is a kind of reign of terror in certain ethnic communities in the country. And what's the legality of all this? I'm reminded of what Richard Nixon said to David Frost: when the president does it, that means it is not illegal. What do you think, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, this is the point, is that it's proceeding right out of the White House. This is a reign of terror that we've never seen before in American history. It's a completely unprecedented, and it's coming out of the rearrangement of power, or the grabbing of power, the seizure of power, really, by the White House. And that is a history too, actually. There have been attempts to do this. There have been attempts to concentrate powers in the White House that would allow a president to do the kinds of things, although I think even there, what Trump's done is much more audacious. But there's a history to this. There's a history to everything. We have to be in mind of that history as well. But in terms of the acts themselves, this is beyond anything imaginable before.
Yeah, you raised 2 points. One is the audaciousness of it and how this has not occurred before. And the other one is getting away with it, which is the unconstitutionality of it, right, in great part because of the Supreme Court decision granting
Correct.
Trump absolute presidential immunity for so-called official acts.
Right.
As it happens, there must be somebody who's an expert, even greater than us, on all this, who could bring to bear both experience and historical understanding, and not simply about one presidency, but about many. And that person would be John W. Dean. And we have him here. He is the former White House counsel to Richard Nixon. He exposed the Watergate scandal. He spoke before the Senate Watergate Committee. Everything he said was proved to be true. He's written numerous books. His most recent book, if I'm not wrong, about Watergate was called Nixon's Defense. And it is an impeccably argued case about how Nixon's defense all the way through on Watergate until it fell apart. John, welcome.
Thank you. I'm not sure I exceed your expertise, other than having lived it at the front line on some of it.
Yeah,
so I'm a frontline observer of what authoritarianism can do, and I have certainly the last 7 years been a hired hand at CNN to watch what was going on at the front line.
Yeah. What's your sense on the question of Trump's, I guess, audacity is a euphemism for people say breaking norms. It's more than norms. It's laws. It's the Constitution, compared to Nixon.
Well, there are few comparisons. There are parallels in personalities between Nixon and Trump. There are very few similarities in presidencies. Trump has pushed the envelope way beyond anything Richard Nixon ever dreamed of. I have watched them, and really to observe the two, they have very similar personalities, where I have focused in my post-Watergate years and post-White House years a lot on studying authoritarian personalities because I was surrounded by them. I wrote my first book on the subject when I really noticed the disintegration of the Republican Party with the coming of the Tea Party and their crowd. Excuse me, I wrote a book called Conservatives Without Conscience. And that I wrote that book because I had been surrounded by those types of people. Now they were in charge. And so it's really, that was during the Obama years, Sidney, that I did that book. So it's been a constant observation to come down to the present where we have Trump in the White House. And all I can tell you in shorthand is that, and we can go longhand later, is that there are no comparisons between Nixon and Trump. He and Trump has made Nixon look like a choir boy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How so?
Well, I think that if we still stay a little bit broad without going through a laundry list, which we can do also, but what I see is that Trump seems to act on every impulse he has, and he has all the wrong impulses. He is a clear poster boy for the authoritarian personality. He has high incompetence, where he doesn't really know how to do these things. He has, in his second term, hired people who know much more about it and know where the levers of power are. Richard Nixon kind of dreamed of these things and did one-shots and then backed down. And I think the big difference between the two men is that Richard Nixon actually had a conscience. He experienced shame. He was not proud of what he ended up getting revealed for. Donald Trump could care less. He doesn't know shame. There's nothing that can trouble him. You can't embarrass the man because he thinks everything he does is fine. So that's the big difference between the personalities. Now, how it's executing in the presidencies is, Nixon pushed the threads of power and the levers of power, but he did so, I think, with a very different motive.
What was that?
What was his motive? That's good. Yeah.
I'll never be accused of being a Nixon apologist, or I don't really have a lot of good things to say about Richard Nixon. It was a very searing experience, but I must say, not only did he have a conscience, he was an establishmentarian. He revered the processes of government. He's somebody who had started his career in Congress as a member of the House, then he became a member of the Senate. While in the Senate, he's selected to become vice president. He actually serves under Eisenhower as acting president, and he really respects these institutions as institutions. Now, did he believe when he became president that he should use his powers? Yes, he did. But what was the motive? If you sift through what Nixon was really all about, he didn't care a hoot about domestic policy. He wanted to create a generation of peace. And I think that's something from his Quaker background. He probably told his mother, if he's ever elected, I will be a peacemaker. While Trump mouthed those words in his inaugural, he has not shown any inclination to do anything like that. He's right now in the middle of deciding whether he's going to be a warrior or a peacemaker as we talk.
But as you know, John, I mean, better than anybody, there was also the dark side of President Nixon. There were the enemies lists. There was the Houston plan.
Well, that's an interesting thing. There's a lot of myth about what was there, that you say the enemies list. Yes, there were. I'm the one who revealed to the Senate the enemies list. I found later in the archives of the Nixon papers, they almost fired me for a refusal to implement the enemies project. What happened to the enemies list is they made the list, sent it over to me, and it went in a desk drawer. And that's the reason I happen to have it all, to turn it over to the. So yeah, Nixon, yes, when he called George Shultz once and told Shultz, I want his Secretary of the Treasury. He said, I want an audit on Larry O'Brien, the head of the Democratic National Committee, the chair. Schultz fought with him and resisted, but they did do something. But it was a one shot. And that's the big difference. There are Jeffrey Toobin had a wonderful piece in the op-ed just day before yesterday or yesterday about the hundreds of investigations that these people have launched against all of his enemies. And they're actually going on quietly right now. It's not a story. It should be a bigger story.
Yeah, they're using the instruments of government to try and financially ruin and discredit, even if there is nothing wrong there.
Correct.
Using that pressure. Nixon may have thought of that, and certainly he used the plumbers to try and go after. I still don't quite get it, what the motive was in invading the DNC office.
DNC, yeah.
Let's clean that up, because when you actually drill down on these things, they're not always what they were seemed at the time. Down to the smoking gun was not really a smoking gun. There's a book that's coming out. I wrote a memo a decade ago and gave it to an attorney friend, and he finally turned it into a book that's coming out in Kansas Press this fall. That shows the smoking gun really wasn't an obstruction of justice. They weren't obstructing Watergate. They were covering up anonymous donors. And no one ever understood this over all the years. I testified about it because actually off camera in the trial of U.S. versus Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Nixon, Ehrlichman, that whole crowd, Mitchell, and it came out in the trial. Nobody's ever seen the record of that trial, but it's been sitting out there, and sadly, history hasn't dug some of this stuff out. So Nixon actually comes off better than the press he got at the time, and what forced him to resign. He had one of the worst defenses. When I say I speak like I sound like a Nixon defender, for Christ's sake.
We know you're not. You paid the price for that, John.
You certainly paid the price, but Donald Trump will bring out anything and anybody sometimes, right?
The invidious comparison to Trump makes Nixon look like an upholder of the Constitution,
which he is in a sense. I've tried to understand and have done some digging. I was once at the Eisenhower Library to see if I could figure out. I sniffed around a little bit, but I really didn't know the papers and wasn't really able to get to what I was looking for. Was the influence that Eisenhower, who was certainly no wallflower when it came to exercising power, he was sort of Nixon's tutor. And I think that Eisenhower's influence on how you exercise power was a behind-the-scenes impact on Nixon when he became president. And he would try it, it would fail, and then he would go on to something else. He had the instincts, no question. But what we're seeing now is a guy who doesn't really understand power. He likes to wield it. He wants to be important. I see more of a narcissist who always wants to be telling everybody what to do and how to do it and thinks he knows everything, when in fact he knows virtually nothing, or even how the process works, and won't listen to anybody who will tell him. So he's an unguided missile at this point. And
you've written a book on this called "The Authoritarian Nightmare: Trump and His Followers."
Right.
Yeah, what I did with that book, Sidney, it was back during the Obama years. I had written a book called "Conservatives Without Conscience," and that's where the first time I had discovered the nature of the authoritarian personality in high-level political positions. I drew heavily on the science of the leading authority on authoritarianism and their personalities. A guy by the name of Robert Altemeyer. He was an American who'd been teaching his entire career up in Canada. Discovered him. I started communicating with him. He realized I was intrigued by his research. He really helped a lot on the book Conservatives Without Conscience. That title came from one of the reasons I use that title is publishers didn't like to use the term authoritarianism in that era. So I said, well, here's what they really are. They are conservatives who absolutely have no shame. They have no emotions. And this was based on Altemeyer's scholarship. So when Trump came down the escalator, I was doing a biweekly column then, did some columns, interviewed him, Altemeyer, and I said, Bob, before the next election, before Trump runs, we've got to lay out who he is. People weren't at that point when we first did that book convinced he was an authoritarian. So the first part of the book deals with Trump's personality and what have you. And the second part deals really with Altemeyer's science. My role was to really kind of write the book, to keep it out of the academic, undigestible tables and charts and coefficients and what have you. And so it was for the lay reader, but it was really his science. And it's a devastating book. And it shows, the full title was Authoritarian Nightmare, Trump and His Followers. And to do the book, we also went to Monmouth's Polling Institute and had them do the first national poll ever to sort of test the American electorate on their authoritarianism. And it's about 35%. And these are his followers. This is his base. And they are ruthless. They are people who are shameless. And they're people who want to be, some of them want to be told what to do. Others want to be authoritarian leaders themselves. And it's a bad combination. And that's who form his base. So we put that book out, yes, and it isn't a pretty picture, and everything that was written in that, as well as the earlier book during the Obama years, has borne terribly true.
Well, I just want to ask a question going back to Nixon for a second, John, which is this, that, as you say, he had bad press at the time, maybe worse than the facts warranted, and yet he was driven from office. There was accountability about those things. There is no accountability whatsoever. Now, we know some of the reasons for that, but why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Sean, you put your finger on the biggest change. Trump is only possible because he's got this base that everybody else in the Republican Party is afraid of, that he can turn them against them, he can primary them, he can find somebody further to the right than the person who's giving him trouble. So it's his base that really empowers him. And that's the second half of that book that we did just before the election, where we tested on a national basis through Monmouth's polling operation. Who are these people? How do they feel, and what have you? And they are ruthless. They are people who are happy with Trump. He literally figured it out, either intuitively or did some polling himself, when he made the statement, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose any voters. And that's true. He wouldn't. These are the people. This is how a democracy can be lost very easily. These people traditionally stayed under the rocks. They were embarrassed, in a sense. Their thinking and attitudes were not widely accepted. Well, Trump has made it okay to be out there and to be themselves, and that's who they are. That is the base that is supporting this guy, that keeps him in power and has dramatically changed the Republican Party. It is no longer the party of a Barry Goldwater or on the right, or a Hugh Scott in the middle. These people would be run out of the party today. They're rhinos to the MAGA crowd.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Your own journey sort of illustrates this. You began as a Goldwater Republican yourself, and here you are now, sounding the alarm about the authoritarian personality in the White House and his followers. And
Sidney, I'm way to the left of you now. I read your material. You look like a conservative to me.
Well, I'm going to use that on my next book.
Yeah, right.
That'll be the blurb. But you've chronicled the fall of a political party, and this is, Barry Goldwater himself decried what had happened with, intolerance that he saw rising towards the end of his life as well.
He did indeed. In fact, the title "Conservatives Without Conscience" came from a conversation with the senator with whom I had a lifetime friendship. He was my roommates in prep school. It was his father, Barry Goldwater Jr., with whom I am still friendly. So I had known the senator since I was about 13 years of age. I never had him, never asked him for anything politically. He was always told me, get out of government sooner rather than later. But he said, do public service. And he indeed, as you know, was a successful department store operator in Arizona. And he had the attitude that, if you're going to complain about it, we'll do something about it. So that's why he ran for the Senate, because he was very unhappy with what was happening in Arizona, and it went on from there. He is, again, not the man I knew, was not the person he has often been characterized as, a right-wing kook. For example, I once asked the senator, I said, how in the hell, I was in law school when the '64 Civil Rights Bill was passed. And he was the one vote against the public accommodation section of the bill. I had gone up, one of my study guys in law school was Governor Paul Bible, and his father was in the Senate at the time. So we got good Senate seats to catch some really historic debate up in the gallery. But I didn't see the senator vote. But I later asked him, I said, how did you vote? How were you the one vote? He said, well, let me tell you a story, John. He said, I knew this Phoenix lawyer who had clerked on the Supreme Court for Robert Jackson, who I thought was a terrific justice. And I had a lot of interaction with this guy. And he came to me about shortly before that vote came up, and he said, Senator, you can't vote for that because it is going to get overturned by the Supreme Court. I guarantee you. And then he laid out this long argument, how I would be on the right side of everything from history to the court and what have you. Mm-hmm. And I said, who was it? He said, Bill Rehnquist.
Really?
So
of course, Rehnquist became Chief Justice, and he was the Nixon appointee after Nixon lost 2 nominations.
I've apologized for that.
You wrote a book about Rehnquist.
I wrote a book, and I told how I was kind of just screwing around. I was out vetting other candidates for the court for the White House, the White House had taken over the role of vetting potential nominees, and I had vetted a woman who would have been the first woman to be on the court, Mildred Lilly, who was in a middle-level appellate court here in California, and she was terrific. And I later would compare her resume with Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman on the court, and Mildred Lilly had a much stronger resume than Reagan's selection of the first woman. Anyway, Nixon was under pressure from his wife, his daughters, and Martha Mitchell, John Mitchell, the Attorney General's wife, who was a very vocal voice at that time on
as we know.
And so he said, well, he said, I kind of feel pressure to do this. Well, so he sent the nomination forward to the committee of this ABA that was then sort of doing the super vetting of the potential justices. And they shot her down 11-1. And he said, I can't go forward with this without ABA support. But privately, on some of the tapes, he's pleased as punch that the ABA has shot her down. but he had honored, he at least pleased his daughter's wife and Martha by sending that nomination forward. But it was the ABA old boys who shot her down.
Just a rule on Goldwater. Goldwater did write a book called The Conscience of a Conservative, and then you write a book about conservatives without a conscience. I always thought that there was a connection there.
There is a connection. It was what happened is when the senator retired, Barry and I are in touch all the time, and we've remained lifetime friends. And he said, my dad's bored as hell. Or he said, why don't you do a book with him? And I said, sure, it'd be fun. So we started talking, and he said, listen, John, I don't understand what's happening to the Republican Party. That's the book I'd like to write. He said, he was then in a public pissing match with Jerry Falwell, the head of the religious right.
Yes, very important.
And he said, he had famously said, Jerry Falwell should be kicked in the butt. He said, I didn't really say the butt. He said, I said it kicked in the nuts is where he actually said he told me he'd done. He said, look, I'm worried that these preachers are going to get control of the Republican Party, and it's going to destroy the party. He said, I don't understand how they think. I don't understand why they think they do, but they think everything they're saying is the word of God, and they won't compromise, and they just keep barreling ahead. And I think it's a disaster if they get a hold of the Republican Party. Why don't we go into that? And in the course of the conversation, he said, these guys claim to be conservative, some of them, but they have no conscience. And I said, boom, there's a title for a book. We actually started on that book while he was still alive. Barry called me and said, listen, the book, Dad loves the idea of the book, but he really feels he's letting down his side of helping you out on it. So why don't you just back off a little bit until he's feeling better? Well, he never felt better. That was, unfortunately, he would pass. But I kept all that material and the idea in my head. And really, it was almost 10 years later that when I was doing what Sidney describes as the evolution and devolution of the Republican Party. That was one of the first in that series where it describes what's happened to the Republican Party, where I took some of the leaders and showed that, these people are not only just religious right, they are conservatives without conscience that are in charge of things.
Speaking of Goldwater, as an example, he played a pivotal role in the Watergate scandal when he and other Republican leaders came down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Another good myth, Sidney.
Okay, you're gonna tell us.
This is myth explosion session. I love it.
Myth explosion session. All right, let me tell you what really happened, because I talked to the senator at length about this. In fact, his son and I did a book. I cranked it out, and then I used my friend Barry to sort of vet it to make sure it wasn't something. He didn't want the family didn't want out, because I got a bunch of his papers that really had never been, his ghostwriters had never seen, and what have you. And we put together a book called Pure Goldwater. And I think that includes the story I'm going to tell you, but this came right from the horse's mouth, where he knew that the media considered, when he and John Rhodes, a representative from Arizona and a part of the leadership of the House, Hugh Scott, who was the minority leader of the Senate, and he were dispatched to go to the White House and tell Nixon it was time to go. He said, that's a great story. He said, I don't talk about it much because I like the story that's out there better than what really happened.
Print the legend.
He said,
print the legend. Right.
So what happened? John, tell us
what really happened.
He said, what did happen is we had one of the liaison people from the White House was constantly calling for nose counts, which Rhodes always had and Hugh Scott always had, of where they were on what they do on impeachment. And so he said what happened is one point, Al Haig got a hold, who was then White House Chief of Staff, said, "Listen, we may need you to talk to the president about what he's going to do and what the vote actually is, and who." And this is after he's lost the Southerners in the House after his conversation with George Wallace, who's told him that he will not support him. And Nixon knows that's going to result for sure with the loss of the Southern conservatives in the House. He will be voted impeached, but it doesn't tell about what's going to happen in the Senate at a Senate trial. So anyway, the senator explained what happened is, we were sort of in touch, and Hugh Scott came to me, the minority leader, and said, we got to go down and be ready to tell Nixon what it really is all about. So it was not initiated on Capitol Hill, as the myth has it, that it was time for the senior people in the Republican Party to come down and tell the president it was time to go. In fact, when they went down, the first thing Haig did was hustle the group into his office and say, for God's sake, don't tell him to resign. He said he's like 95%, if not better, there. He's decided it on his own that he just can't survive and govern and what have you. So don't upset that apple cart. And so they all agreed not to. And Senator Goldwater said, when we went in the Oval Office, he said, I've never seen Nixon happier. He said he reminded me of a guy who had just hit a hole in one at the golf course and was going to have to buy everybody a drink, and was pleased to talk about it. That's his experience. And he said he has feet up on the desk, and he was just in a great mood. And he finally got around to asking, what's the vote? And they didn't have any good news for him. And Goldwater said, including me, I told him I couldn't vote for him at this point. So they did give him the accurate nose count, but they didn't say boo about resigning. So this is not what the myth really happened. There's an element of truth in it, but more myth than truth.
It's interesting. They were willing to.
But it's a great story. It's a great story. And makes the Republican Party look better than they may have deserved.
Yeah, but it also shows their willingness to just tell him what the facts were as they saw them.
And nobody around Trump would ever do such a thing.
Nobody around Trump would tell him today.
Not only sycophants on his staff who don't present, the evidence of what's going on, but also the senators and the representatives in the Congress are terrified of Trump, and they do not speak the truth.
Again, it's his ability to sick his base on them that I think is his strength. If his base ever leaves him, if they've had enough, which is not going to happen. I mean, cults and authoritarian bases, there's really little distinction. Some of those who write about cults write about the authoritarian nature of the cult leader and what have you, but they do no wrong, and they've as Jim Jones showed, they will follow them to their own end. It is so over the top. I actually have a couple friends who are in the cult and who I talk to just to try to understand them. And it is not reasoning that works. One's a very successful attorney, and he somehow separates his admiration, and he has a lot of rationalization, which with the book I did on authoritarianism explains how these personalities do this, how they can compartmentalize, rationalize, and think themselves normal when in fact they are not. But it is a unique phenomena, particularly when you run into somebody who's intelligent and carries on in life like a normal person.
As it happens, John, you're also an expert in another president and have written a book about him. And I believe that is part of a presidential series edited by none other than Sean Wilentz. It was a biography of Warren G. Harding. And
I didn't get the pleasure of Sean. I think
I wish
his
I'd had the pleasure.
It was Arthur Schlesinger Jr. who did mine. Who actually, I read that the series. Arthur, I'd known Arthur for years. We had lectured together. We had lunches together, and I had his private number. And when the series was first announced, one or two, and the first couple are really kind of pathetic. Sean knows the series, and they really are.
Sean got it passed down to him by Arthur.
I inherited it from Arthur. I was greatly honored to be able to do so. I had written one of them about Jackson, but then he allowed me to go ahead and pick it up. But I think maybe yours came out after he had passed. Is that right?
No. I'm one of the last ones before he passes.
Got it.
Actually, when I called Arthur about the series, I said, Arthur, I'm not calling about Nixon because I know I shouldn't touch that in your series. I'm not the right guy. But how about Warren Harding? He said, how about Warren Harding?
Yeah,
I said, what are you going to do with Harding?
Absolutely.
He said, I said, what are you going to do with Harding? He said, I have no idea what to do with Harding. He said, you want to do it? Is that why you're calling? I said, yes, it is. I said, I grew up in part of my youth before I went off to high school. My father ran a company there. It was one of the biggest employers in town. And I used to deliver newspapers right by up and down the street Harding's home was on.
This is what, Marion, Ohio?
Marion, Ohio.
Yes, Marion, Ohio. I said he was my first president because our next door neighbor had taken over his job as the editor of the Marion Star, and gave me my first book actually gave me two books on Harding. The first one was just kind of a general book on Harding. And then it was the second one was called The President's Daughter, which was about his purported affair with a Marion girl. And I had to get permission from my mother, who wouldn't give it to me, to read the book. I didn't read it for years. She said, no, you're not going to read that. I was, 13, 14 years of age, or 12 or 13 or whatever it was. But I was still a voracious reader at the time. And anyway, I had picked up enough from Jack Maxwell, his successor, who a lot of Harding people were still at the paper at the time, and so he had some wonderful anecdotes about Harding. And I just had this. I had no knowledge of presidential history. I didn't know presidential historians had all panned him and made him the worst president, what have you. When I first started studying him. So when I told Arthur, I said, Arthur, I don't think that Warren Harding has been given a very fair shake. From the reports I have, he was not even involved in the Teapot Dome scandal, other than to authorize something he knew nothing about what it was going to be done for. And he damn near choked the one guy in his White House when he heard about a scandal that was caused. I said,
so it's really unfair to compare Trump and Harding as somehow comparatively corrupt figures. How would you compare them in terms of the corruption and their administration?
It's night and day, literally. Harding is somebody who was a successful, hardworking businessman who'd bootstrapped himself up, doing things honestly and fairly, and had low tolerance for any kind of political corruption. And certainly that was his record throughout as a state legislator and then as a member of the Senate. The guy who he selects that becomes the head of the Interior Department, Albert Fall, was the desk beside him in the Senate and was a very well-respected senator. And in fact, Harding had his cabinet unanimously approved by the Senate, which is extremely rare even then. And Albert Fall being amongst that group. In fact, I just a couple of weeks ago got back two very large boxes of material on the Teapot Dome scandal that I have not had time to ever really study. But when I was doing some other research at the National Archives, I had downtime. And so I got the people who keep the records of trials to give me dig out the historical record of the several trials of Albert Fall, who was convicted of bribery. The problem,
and it was to get oil leases.
Yeah, for
what
oil
was
leases.
called the Teapot Dome, which was in what state was that? Wyoming.
Wyoming, right?
Yeah.
And some of it reached into California and what have you. But when I had just enough knowledge to realize that the trial that convicted Albert Fall, making him, I guess, the fall guy, the trial was riddled with things that would never pass muster today. In fact, the person who purportedly bribed him was a guy by the name of Doheny, who was a very wealthy oil man.
Right. Ed Doheny, was that his name?
Doheny was his name. And he was not convicted. The jury ruled that he had not bribed Albert Fall. But yet
the Attorney General involved too?
Pardon?
Was the Attorney General involved?
That's Doherty, and Doherty is not involved in any of this at all in Teapot Dome. Doherty has his own set of problems.
He gets involved in a different scandal, doesn't he?
Different scandals that for which he was never convicted for anything either. Anyway, the Teapot Dome the end of that story has not been written because I think if somebody goes through the trial under today's standards, they'll find that the government just they went after Fall until he was a broken man. He was ill. He couldn't really defend himself. He'd run out of money. And the government can get anybody. And that's the scary part of what today is that Trump has got all these private investigations going, and he's gonna pick some people out and try to convict them and send them to jail.
If I may say quickly, I mean, that's absolutely right. But just as an editor, I've got to say that John's book has done more to reassess, really, truly, the presidency of Warren Harding, which has gone under a reassessment. There are other books and articles written subsequently. And, I got to say, Warren Harding owes you one, John, because you really did in a very effective way. I'm very proud of all of the books that we publish, but yours in particular, to have my name associated with it is great.
It's the only good book review I've ever had from the Wall Street Journal.
Well, I mean, in some ways, though, this is also like Grant, too. I mean, Grant was really in obloquy for a very, very long time, and there's been a great reversal and revival of him on a much larger scale, much bigger deals, Civil War and Reconstruction and so forth. But nevertheless, there are these reassessments, and we owe a lot to the reassessors like yourself.
Well, Harding did things like went into the South, where Birmingham, his famous Birmingham Speech, and Woodrow Wilson, his predecessor, had pretty well divided the country and fanned the racist fires that existed. And Harding waded right into it and said, "Listen, we can't exist as a country this way." And his audience was separated by a fence where the blacks were on one side and the whites were on the other side. And he just went right after the whites and said, "Listen, this is all wrong."
Now, wasn't he also subjected to a kind of birther campaign where he was accused of being partly black?
Yes.
In the 1920 campaign.
There was a professor from Worcester College in Ohio that was convinced that his family tree indicated that he was a black man. The the big sin of Harding has been unraveled, and my book did that too, because I put a huge footnote in that I wasn't sure, but based on town rumor that he had had a child by a woman by the name of Nan Britton, who wrote the book President's Daughter. That no one really believed Nan Britton about anything, and so on and so forth. But today we can test that genetically.
Yeah. Yes.
And a friend of mine kept the Harding family are all doctors, generations of them. Harding's brother was a doctor, his father was a doctor, so and so. He's one of the few that didn't.
Are you in touch with the Harding family?
Yes, I am. I am high on their list as a result of that book. But anyway, Peter Harding, who is a psychiatrist up in the Bay Area, we tracked down Nan Britton's grandson, and genetically
that's good enough for DNA,
and found out indeed he is Harding's great grandson. So the mystery is solved.
And was that published anywhere? That information?
Yeah, yes, but not. I don't know. I'm sure that new books about Harding are getting that right, because it was published enough places when it happened. But the source of it was the series that Sean now edits that provoked.
Well, now I'm triply proud. Now I'm especially proud. I mean, I thought the only one who was getting DNA tests was poor Thomas Jefferson, of course, which the DNA tests there. But to see that again with Harding, for well and for ill, I'm happy to have the record straight. I'm just an historian.
Yes, exactly. That was my. I just wanted to know. He actually quietly took care of the child, Nan's child, through his sister. And that's how they raised it. So he wasn't that he did it, denied it, and abandoned it.
Right.
But that was kept pretty well secret. And I didn't have any of that information when I did the book, or I would have added it, just because he. So I say he's the kind of guy who did the right thing.
Yeah.
He just politically knew it was over if he acknowledged it was his child.
Yeah, this is not exactly the 34 criminal felony counts that someone was convicted of.
Thank you. It is. It's still stunning to me that a person who has 34 felonies and was really publicly announcing he was running for president to stay out of jail succeeded at that get out of jail card. It's quite remarkable in our history.
Can I ask one other question, though, about the authoritarian part?
Sure.
Which has to do with, yes, there is a space, they will do anything, but it's the violence that strikes me as important. I mean, you have Lisa Murkowski, for example, saying that Republicans in the Senate are physically scared. They are frightened. There is a reign of terror, not just in parts of Los Angeles. There's a reign of terror in our highest institutions, because these backers, they won't just primary him. There are death threats out there. This, again, how does that fit into your whole picture of how the authoritarianism works? I mean, it strikes me as very important.
I've got to go back through the data. There clearly is a very violent streak in the authoritarian personality. Since it's become so clear that it's there, I need to resift our data and see what that is. But there are also, there are divisions within authoritarian personalities, those who are pro and anti-violence. I don't know that polling has been done that breaks that down. I recently keynoted a conference at Notre Dame that brought together about 100 scholars who study democracy, and they're social scientists, so they look, they dig, and we had some discussions there about that, but nobody really has the answers to how prevalent this is. It's clearly there. it's conspicuous. And Trump that's a flame he wants to fan to make him even more threatening. So it is troublesome. And it's something that's on my agenda to look through the data I have and see. Bob Altemeyer passed away in February. So otherwise he would be on it.
Yeah. So the Republican Party, some people think there's this phantom Republican Party out there, a real Republican Party of, rhinos, and somehow this is all going to go away. And then the Republicans, whatever this imaginary thing is, will return. But what's your view about it? You have enormous experience living this, knowing some of the key principles on a close basis and having written about it.
Well, Sidney, I have been an independent since Watergate. I'm not an ideologue of any sort, and never was. My mother was, I'm sure, voted mostly Democrat. My father, for tax reasons, voted Republican, but it wasn't it wasn't a partisan household. So I didn't grow up with it, and just sort of stumbled into it when Barry Jr., I used to go visit his dad, and realized, and then when I was in law school, Barry said, "Oh, you got to drop out of law school and help us campaign. We're going to win." I said, "I'm not sure that's going to happen, but I'm not going to drop out of law school either." But anyway, I was not partisan influences that ever drove me to become a Republican. I did it just because that's where my parents were registered, and I think a lot of people do register just because that's what their parents were and it's what they know in their household. I am a little bit more sophisticated than that now, and have much stronger feelings and understandings. And I don't see a future for the Republican Party. I think I think Trump will destroy it before he finishes it. There will be the MAGA wing, and I don't. They will call themselves Republicans, but they are, the Republican Party I was a part of and voted for was a big tent party, ran from Jacob Javits to a Barry Goldwater, and Goldwater today, as I say, would be considered a rhino. So it's a very different situation. I think a two-party system is very important to the process and the way the mechanics of our democracy work. But the midterms are very important. I noticed that Trump's plans called for 180 days of implementation from inauguration to sort of the final implementation of their initial run at it. And that's clear why, because I think they know what they're doing is not going to sell and they may well be all thrown out at the midterms. The House looks very clear that they'll lose the House. The Senate is iffy, but not impossible. It's a reach, but not out of reach. So, and that's when things will change. They'll start bringing him back within some boundaries that will make him probably chaff even more. But and very important elections coming up, because we took democracy off the ballot, so to speak, when Biden stepped aside, and Kamala certainly didn't run on the democracy issue, and that's the most pressing thing we're confronted with, whether this form of government is going to survive.
Yeah. So the question almost everybody talks about is, in terms of Trump, is how does this end? Do you have a thought on that?
On how to dissent?
How does
this end? Where are we headed?
How does this end?
You have a thought? You've done research on authoritarian personalities. What happens?
Well, yes, I do. The question is there anybody who can pick up his mantle? Because he clearly is not a man in good health. He could drop dead tomorrow. Many people wish he would. And the question is, who would step up? I think that he had in his mind, when he selected J.D. Vance, somebody who might. Vance is a little smarter, but doesn't have the same kind of personality that Trump has. I always envisioned Trump as making his real life calling he would have been a good maitre d' in a big New York restaurant where somebody slipped him the 20 or the 100 or whatever was the going top rate, and he would make sure you got the right seat and nobody bothered you. But that's the end.
No one offered him that job.
It is a shame nobody offered him that job. That is the top of his skill set. But so how will it end? It'll end when Trump dies, and that is unpredictable. He looks to me like he's trying to get his weight under control, but who knows if that is happening.
You don't see a successor of somebody who
natural successor, yeah.
No, I don't see a natural successor.
Skills at demagoguery that he has.
Well, his skill set was augmented by a very odd circumstance of his having that Apprentice reality television show, which took him into millions of households to portray him as somebody he wasn't, but actually being very talented and skilled and authoritarian. The tough but funny and clever boss and what have you. I never saw the television series when it was running and had no interest. I didn't know Donald Trump and never had read anything about him until he came down on the escalator. Yeah, I knew of him from pop culture, but I ignored him. I knew he was a big personality in New York, but I never followed him. There was nothing to follow in my world. So I think this based on the pattern and looking particularly abroad, he has built no sort of apparatus to take on his causes, because his causes don't go beyond him. It is his life. He's totally transactional. Everything is for Donald Trump. Loyalty is something that runs only one way, and that is to him. So he's not built anything that can go on, Sidney. It ends with he ends. Now the question is, what will the Republicans who do support him do? I think, first of them, I think a lot of them will have a sigh of relief. And I think they're back to scratch to figure out what they're going to do, because
they all hate him in private. I mean,
yes, they do.
The senators, the members of the House, and so on. They loathe him, and
exactly. And even his followers, they don't really like him. They know they couldn't rent a room in his hotels. They couldn't afford them, but they're charmed by him. And he is doing what they want to have done, and that is to give the finger to everybody and go off and do what they want to do. And he thought that they would. The voters I talked to and the polling we show that they believed that he would create an economy and a world in which they could have it their way. That it does not appear to be what's going to happen.
Yeah. Well,
I think it's pretty much start from scratch.
Yeah.
And I do not believe the Democrats are in the disarray that the media would have them.
Why do you say that, John?
Well, it's good. It's good theater to have. It's good press to have them all over the lot. I know a lot of Democratic big league players, and they know exactly what they want to do. and it's pick up where they left off, and find find somebody who can get elected and get on with business. They have not changed, and their message. The horse race part of media coverage, I find pretty boring.
Yeah,
it's pretty meaningless.
Yeah. Well, look, we really appreciate that you took the time to speak with us. It's been a pleasure. And
I haven't had as happy an hour in a very, very long time.
Yeah.
Good.
I don't think I have ever held a more interesting conversation about Warren G. Harding ever. And I look forward to speaking with you again and staying in touch, John.
Back on the Court of History, please.
So, yes. So for the Court of History, which is the ultimate court, thank you, John Dean. And on behalf of Sean Wilentz, stay tuned for the next episode.
I will look for your ruling on this one.
Yes, very good. Thank you, John Dean.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.